So we left off with this question. What is art? Is this art? I think most of us would agree with the judge that Brancusi's bird in space is art. But what about a feather that someone picks up in the forest, mounts on a stand, and labels flight? It's not an entirely hypothetical question. The stone on the left was not manipulated by an artist. The human face was carved naturally by geological forces. Yet this pebble was found near a site in Africa occupied by early hominids. I'm probably going to mispronounce this. Australopithecus africanus. The Smithsonian's guess as to what these hominids look like is on the right based on the skulls. What intrigues archaeologists is that the pebble was not found in a place that would have been deposited naturally, but rather near a site where these hominids hung out. So the impulse to, if you will, pick up a feather in the forest and attach some significance to it is very, very old. In this case, a mind-boggling 3 million years old, predating Homo sapiens. Back to Homo sapiens for the rest of the course. The very oldest art that might fit our big idea definition, material clearly manipulated by an artist, also comes from Africa. Archaeologists have found geometric incisions cross-hatching on rocks and eggshells. We really have no idea what these carvings meant, but they almost surely represent some effort to convey an idea in symbols, which is a huge step forward for the human race and a precursor to writing as well as to art. So now we get to our very oldest work on the required works list, the first on the required list from the College Board. So far, the animals painted in charcoal, ochre, and white are the oldest representational art that archaeologists have found. That is, the oldest art depicting an object that we can actually recognize. So why did Stone Age painters invariably paint in profile? Well, it's easier, for one, but it's also the view that conveys the most information about an animal's basic shape. You've read about this work, and I don't have a lot more to say except that the most likely questions about this work will involve its location, its age, and its status as the oldest representational art we've found so far. Now we fast forward 10,000 years to the second image in the College Board list, the Hall of Bulls at the caves of Lascaux in France. Let me just note that explorers discovered prehistoric cave paintings in the mid-1800s, first in India, then in Spain. The consensus among art historians and archaeologists at the time was that these had to be fakes. And then in 1940, a French teenager, Marcel Ravidat, was out walking in the wood with his dog, Robot, which we see here. When they came to a sunken spot in the ground, the dog started sniffing and pawing through the leaves. Marcel went to investigate, and he found a vertical shaft. 4 days later, he returned with an oil lamp and 3 friends to investigate. This virtual tour will give you some idea of what the 4 boys saw that afternoon. We're going to talk more about this fascinating art, but first, a very quick history lesson. Historians divide prehistoric, pre-writing history into 3 periods. You really only need to know about 2. Paleolithic, when people used only simple tools, hunted or gathered their food rather than growing it, and lived in small family or clan groups. And Neolithic, when farming and larger scale communities developed. Today, we're going to hang out entirely in the Paleolithic era. So on this slide, you see the opening statement of the College Board's curriculum framework for global prehistoric art. Note the phrase that I've underlined. You've gathered by now that I sometimes have my concerns about the College Board. So here's my question. What do these extraordinary paintings say about the claim that survival was Paleolithic man's paramount concern? How would Paul Johnson, the author of the cave art reading that you did for today, respond to this statement? To understand how important the human impulse to create art really is, we need to think about just how hard it was to make these paintings and how much they cost a society with very limited resources. Some of these bulls are over 20 feet long. To paint them on the cave ceiling, artists would have had to erect scaffolding, and we know that they did, because we can still see the holes carved into the wall where the scaffolding went, and these are holes carved in stone with stone. As you saw from the virtual tour, Those were painted in very dark, narrow, remote corners of the cave. To paint in this environment, artists needed to use torches soaked in animal fat, and they needed even more animal fat to mix these natural minerals into pigment so that the paint stuck to the walls. Why do I think using large quantities of animal fat is such a big deal? Fat meant calories, and for these people, calories meant survival. In other words, these paintings were important enough that Paleolithic people were willing to crawl into tight, scary places, to lie, kneel, or stand for hours on wooden platforms, to give up a resource that might mean the difference between starving or surviving the winter. Why? Well, that's a much debated question. You're going to see a lot of video clips this year. Let's turn to our first, which is from a BBC documentary series called How Art Made the World. As always, the whole video will be up on Moodle, and we'd love to have you watch it. The most famous section of the Lascaux cave complex is the Great Hall of the Bulls. 16 different animals show up on the cave walls, but these are the biggest. And actually, they aren't really bulls. They're giant oryx, wild oxen that are the ancestor of domestic bulls, really closer in size to the buffalo. So here's another panel from Lascaux. Oops. What do you see here besides the flying bull? Well, these look like horses, but actually they're early equines, or the ancestors of the modern-day horse. There are more than 300 equine figures in these caves. It's the most commonly represented animal. They were not domesticated horses, by the way. We know from archaeological excavation of middens, and that's just a fancy archaeological term for garbage heaps, that Paleolithic people hunted equines for food. Domestication came later and started with dogs. Let me make another point, since this question has shown up on AP exams in the past. We know from carbon dating and other archaeological investigations that these animals were not all painted at the same time, so we can't assume that a particular collection of animals reflected a deliberate composition. The artist may just have been looking for a blank space on the wall. Now here we see oryx, horses, and deer. So how and why did Paleolithic artists choose their subjects? Let's return to our video. I'm about to make a very important point about all of the prehistoric art we're going to see in the remainder of this unit, so pay attention, okay? Prehistoric means just that. These are people for whom we do not have a written history. We do have a fair amount of information. We have carbon-14 evidence from archaeological sites, which gives us a fairly good idea of how old artifacts are. We can look for what is called ethnographic analogy. In other words, we look at historic records from people who lived in the same area, and we try to draw inferences from similarities to prehistoric works or prehistoric culture. Your next set of readings will include an article on the camelid sacrum that makes hypotheses based on later cultures in central Mexico, for which we have some history. We'll read similar inferences when we get to the jade Kong from China. But these are just inferences. They could be wrong. One reason I love to teach cave paintings is that there are so many theories about what they could mean. So let's start out with yours. What do you think these Paleolithic Europeans, these Paleolithic Europeans painted oryx, equines, and deer? Since you've already read about cave paintings, you may not have accepted my rather blatant invitation to answer that Paleolithic artists painted animals that they hunted. But at first, this seemed like the most obvious explanation. So let's return to the video. Here is still another image from Lascaux. I don't know about you, but I've never seen horns like these outside of a Dr. Seuss book. Why might the artist have painted horns with this odd and exaggerated shape? And what might these dots represent? Well, another theory about the cave paintings was that the animals painted were power animals whose presence would protect the people or summon the spirits, or were themselves the reincarnated spirits of ancestors. Can you think of a character from popular fiction who has a stag as a power animal? Yep, the stag is Harry Potter's Patronus. The power animal or Patronus theory might explain why this stag has super elky antlers. If you find this intriguing, we put a Find Your Spirit Animal quiz up on Moodle just for fun. Feel free to email me and tell me what your Patronus turns out to be. But this suggests another closely related theory, that cave paintings were created as part of shamanistic rituals or to depict shamanistic visions. Shamans are ritual experts. They're often found in hunting communities. They enter into trance states in which they visit the world of the spirits. They take these trips to retrieve the lost souls of the desperately ill, to influence the weather, to oppose witches or evil spirits, even to negotiate with animal spirits over their willingness to become dinner. Returning us to the hunting theory, although through a back door. The relationship between art and shamanistic rituals is actually going to be an important theme in this course, especially when we look at non-Western art. So here's a terrific example, which we'll encounter later in the course. During a potlatch ceremony, a dancer from this Northwest Coast tribe wore an eagle mask. When he pulled a string, the eagle transformed into the face of an ancestor, hence the name. In your last homework assignment, you read a short excerpt from Black Elk Speaks, which is a first-person account of a Lakota Sioux spiritual leader who witnessed animal ancestor transformations in his dreams. We don't know, of course, if Paleolithic people experienced similar visions or performed shamanistic rituals, but since shamanism shows up in widely disparate cultures, it's at least a strong possibility. One piece of support for the shamanistic ritual theory is that the Lascaux artist painted in some of the darkest, most inaccessible corners of the cave. Bad places to choose if the paintings were intended to instruct young hunters, maybe good places to conduct secret rituals away from prying eyes or where only the spirits could reach you. Another piece of support for the shamanism theory, by the way, comes from art that's produced thousands of miles away and thousands of years into the future. The San Bushmen of South Africa also painted in caves, but in this case, recently enough that anthropologists were able to interview a few very elderly shamans who explained that these paintings were indeed records of shamanistic visions. Here again, we have to be very careful when we're comparing across time and geographical areas. We're looking for similarities. We can speculate, but we should be careful about drawing inferences between very different societies and very different times. So how about these remarkable works of rock art? Do you recognize either of them? You can find both of these images here in Utah. On the left is the psychopomp. That's a name, of course, that 20th century people came up with, but it means guider of souls. It's actually a Greek term. And it's found in the San Rafael Swell, Buckhorn Wash. And on the right, you see the All-American Man, which is found in a remote corner of Canyonlands National Park. These are also prehistoric works, even though the so-called psychopomp is only about 2,000 years old and the All-American Man is a youngster. Radiocarbon dating puts it at about 1260 CE. And by the way, there are some people who think it may be a fake. This is an ongoing debate. Were these shamans? That's one theory. The main reason I've included them is to point out that you don't just have to limit your rock art encounters to viewing computer images. You can hike to these extraordinary works, although I will warn you that the hike to the All-American Man is not a day hike, for most of us at least. It's more of an overnight backpacking trip. So let's get back to the Lascaux Caves Dr. Seuss reindeer. What do you make of the dots? What do we sometimes use dots for to represent in paintings? Well, how about stars? So here's still another theory, that some of these paintings were actually astronomical maps. A German researcher, for example, thinks that the cluster of dots over the bull's shoulder is the Pleiades constellation as it looked 16,000 years ago. On the right, you see how the constellation looks today. Some cave painting sites also seem to have been chosen because the setting sun lit up their interiors on the day of the winter solstice. I don't believe that's true of Lascaux, by the way. We'll talk more about the relationship between art and astronomy in a couple of days when we look at Stonehenge. Before we leave Lascaux, let's look at just a few more famous images. Here again, we see two oryx, or bulls. Take a look at the legs. What do you notice? Well, the bulls appear to be moving, which is hard to accomplish. Why are the legs crossed? This may not seem like an impressive achievement, but in fact, this painting makes a huge artistic and mental breakthrough. We already talked about a fundamental challenge of any painting, which is how to convey three-dimensional reality on a two-dimensional surface to create a sense of volume. The way the artist has placed the animal's hindquarters makes one bison seem closer to the viewer, and the one on the right is painted on a section of cave that juts out, giving it the impression that it's coming toward the viewer. Artists would not achieve this kind of perspective again until the 15th century CE. Artists wouldn't get the leg movements this right until the 20th century, when photographers set them straight. Here's another of your required works from the future. There's a great story behind this series of photos. Leland Stanford, railroad magnate and former governor of California, was a great horse lover, and he contended that at some point in a gallop, all four of a horse's feet really did leave the ground. Urban legend has it that he wagered $25,000 on this proposition. That was very serious money in 1878. Most historians, alas, think this is just an embellishment to the story. Anyway, what we do know as a matter of historical record is that Stanford enlisted the help of a scientist and photographer, Edward Muybridge. I may be pronouncing that wrong. Muybridge set up 12 cameras attached to tripwires, and then when a horse crossed them, the wire basically took a photo. And here's the result, which proved Stanford's point and helped usher in a 20th century art form, which was cinema. So why did cave artists figure this out about 15,000 years before Muybridge and Stanford's bet? We don't know, although the author of the Smithsonian article speculates that figuring out animal motion was a matter of life and death for Paleolithic hunters. We're back to the hunting theory. And now we come to what may be the most famous and controversial painting in the caves of Lascaux. It's not the required College Board image, but I did stick it in your workbook. What are we seeing for the first time here, and for the only time among Lascaux's 2,000-some images, about 900 of which are animals, and the rest hands in various geometric shapes? We're seeing a man. It's a pretty strange man. He has the head of a bird and a rather prominent penis. Some historians think he's a shaman. The bird on a stick supports that theory. It might be a shaman's rattle. Birds tend to play an important role in shamanistic religions, possibly because birds can occupy two realms, the earth and the heavens. We also see what looks like a broken spear and intestines spilling out of the bull. There's also a woolly rhino on the left, although it may have been painted at a different time. We can't know for sure, but it's also possible that this painting tells a story of a hunt, and that would make it a very early narrative painting. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on cave paintings. We won't be able to indulge ourselves as much with the other images in this unit, but if you have time, I want to come back to the question we began with. What is art and why is it created? The AP exam no longer includes a quote-based essay, but I'm going to throw quotes at you throughout the year anyway. Here's the first. Alberti was a famous artist, architect, and above all, art critic during the Renaissance. We'll encounter him again. For now, let's think about what he has to say about art. What does this first underlined part of his statement mean in your own words? Basically, he's saying that art began by imitating nature. Not an implausible hypothesis. But I think it's more interesting to look at the second part of the Alberti quote. They began to take away or otherwise supply whatever seemed lacking to effect and complete the true likeness. This is why finding a rock shaped like a human face doesn't make it art. Again, we'll talk about the urinal exception later. But shaping art into the likeness of a human face is art. The artist has to make a change, adding to or subtracting from what he or she sees. This is what the College Board refers to as manipulating. So what about that phrase, true likeness? What does it mean that a piece of art provides a true likeness? Could these both be a true likeness of a bird in flight? I think so. But if so, what does true likeness mean? Well, one possible definition of a true likeness is a work of art that captures what the eye actually sees. Art historians rather helpfully call this optical art. So here you see a Dutch still life from the Baroque era, maybe the high point of meticulously realistic renderings, at least until the invention of photography. Look at the way the artist is able to capture transparent glass. Wow. But how does this early 20th century painter try to capture the true likeness of a war machine? An armored train filled with soldiers firing rifles. Or actually, I think firing machine gun, well, rifles, I guess. Sorry. The artist clearly did not paint an armored train the way it would show up in a photograph. Instead, he tried to paint his subject in a way that somehow conveys the war machine's essence. And how did the artist do this? Mostly he tried to convey movement by showing multiple images, rather like making a movie by flicking a stack of pictures. Again, think of the Muybridge image. Why are the soldiers highly stylized and almost identical? What point might the artist be making? Well, maybe he's saying that when they put on their uniform, soldiers become part of the machine, dangerous, anonymous, interchangeable. So in its way, this painting is a kind of true likeness. It isn't optical, but it is descriptive and it is conceptual because it communicates information about an armored train. Sorry about the confusing terminology. Art historians use the term descriptive when an artist adjusts the optical view in a way that conveys more information about how the subject actually looks. They use the term conceptual when the artist tries to communicate an idea beyond physical appearance. Either way, this approach uses art to convey a different kind of true likeness. So let's apply the optical descriptive concept distinction to a Paleolithic work that isn't one of our required images. On the one hand, this is clearly an antelope. We recognize the pointed horns, the long, slender legs. Our eyes see these features, right? On the other hand, it's hard to capture every element of an antelope's body with any two-dimensional image. We just can't see an animal from every angle at the same time. So this artist has cheated a little by carving the animal in what is called twisted perspective. That is, with the body in profile as seen from the side, but the head twisted into a frontal position so we can see both ears, both eyes, both horns. Would we see an antelope in nature twisted into this position? Probably not, although my dogs accomplished some pretty amazing twisted positions. Do we learn more about the antelopes because the artist chooses this perspective? Yes. So the artist is sacrificing some optical accuracy for descriptive accuracy. Do you see any evidence of more conceptual or symbolic art? Well, there are those mysterious interior lines. What are they supposed to be? Maybe the lines were meant to indicate intestines or other internal organs that the viewer wouldn't actually see, but might be mighty good eating to a Paleolithic family. Maybe they represent the animal's spirit. Maybe they're wounds the hunter inflicted or hoped to inflict. Maybe the petroglyph was intended to give the hunter magical powers. Again, we don't know, but clearly the artist is trying to convey information about the subject that goes beyond simply what our eye can see. These two Paleolithic works illustrate still more decisions that even the earliest artist has to make. Where do these objects exist in space and time? Where does the viewer stand? So take a look at the antelope. Given the way the antelope is rendered, where would the viewer have to stand to see it this way? Well, we could only see this view looking down, what we call an aerial perspective. And what about the bull? Where is it standing? Where are we? And here's a related question. What does not appear in any of these Paleolithic paintings, or for that matter, in the rock sculpture? This illustration may give you a better idea of what the painted bull is missing. It's missing a ground line, or a place to stand, and a horizon line that shows where we stand. These telephone poles are at the same height, and they're actually located in the same place on the page. Yet we get a very different impression when the ground and horizon lines change. We've already established that Paleolithic cave painters were talented artists. Is it possible that they left out horizon lines deliberately? That the bulls were meant to be seen as somehow outside of time and place? Well, we just don't know. Here's another puzzling composition decision. These animals seem to be placed almost randomly. They face in different directions. There's no identifying vegetation or landscape to tell us where they are. What's more, these animals would not hang together in nature. Does that mean that the artist placed them haphazardly? Does it mean that they were painted at different times by different people and they don't really belong together optically or conceptually? Or did the artist want to convey some deeper meaning by bringing these animals together? All together now? We don't know. The answer could very well be all of the above. In my next lecture, we will continue to explore these issues as we look at more prehistoric works.